Hello and welcome to the Opus Wealth Style Podcast. I'm your host today, Evan Wohl, and joined with my two trusty compadres, Alex Azuaje and Harrison Welsh. How you guys doing today?
Doing good, Evan. Thank you.
Good. Hanging in there.
Alex, I believe this is your second time on the pod. Is that right?
It is, yeah. It's had a little bit of a break in between my first appearance, but I'm excited to come back here and have a good conversation.
Let's do it. And Harrison is a rookie today.
Long time listener,
Nice.
first time joiner. Very
Love it.
excited.
I
There
love
we
it.
go.
Well, today we're going to be talking about Gen Z. Uh, the just more definition of who they are, and mostly as it relates to their financial decisions, how they think about money, planning, etc. And so Alex has done a great job of researching the topic and putting a presentation together. So today is not a presentation. We're going to keep it more conversational. But Alex, let's kick it off by just first starting. Tell us a little bit about the demographics of who Gen Z are for the listening audience. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm like a middle of the road millennial, maybe slightly older. I think you
Yep.
guys are older Gen Z, right? Like at the very tail end. So anyway, you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about like the demographics of Gen Z. We could start there.
Absolutely. And just like any sort of definition when it comes to broad demographics, it gets a little blurred on either side. But generally speaking, we're talking about a demographic of people who were born in the range of 1996, 97 to around 2013, 2014. That's the real encompassing, bounds of Gen Z. According to an E&Y study, that's roughly about 15% of the US population at around 48.6 million people.
You say
Um,
50% is Gen Z, is that right?
15%.
15, that makes more sense. All right.
15%.
Uh-huh.
And actually, I think, Harrison, you fall in kind of that blurred edge of the older Generation Z, right?
No, exactly. I was born in 1996, graduated in the first Gen Z class of 2015. We were the vanguard.
There you go. Right.
Yep.
First of the foray. So you'll probably resonate with a fair amount of what we'll discuss today, but the key thing that identifies this particular generation is how integrated the internet, social media, all of those facets of technology are into their daily lives. So they're called digital natives. They're the first generation to have grown up with it from the very get-go, being as a part of our daily life. Evan, you might know this, obviously, being in the millennial generation like me. We eventually got the internet in the form of an AOL dial-up, most likely. AIM, those early kind of aughts exposure to technology, but the Generation Z has had it since the very first day.
I
Being
still
that
I still remember is it
your
AIM
screen name,
user? DH Yankee, something like that.
there you go.
Classic.
Um, Key things that shape the formation of Gen Z from a psychological and specifically from a financial memory perspective. That'll be a topic of conversation today, and their trends and patterns as regarding their finances. They've seen some pretty significant events. Number one, they've seen the global recession in
Mhm.
2007, and how that's affected their households. And then even in more recent memory, the 2020 coronavirus shutdown and subsequent effects, both financially and psychologically speaking. So some interesting demographics about Gen Z when they are asked, how do they feel about where they stand, both personally, socially, economically, financially. They are a very pragmatic generation. They're less, driven to, I think, what is a common characteristic of the millennial generation, like achieve your dreams, everybody's special. They are much more like we have to have achievable goals. They are more pessimistic from from what they believe or what their views are on their personal goals. They're a little bit more critical of being able to achieve the same level of goals as millennials are.
Mhm.
They tend to be a more anxious generation. You see a little bit more prevalence of things like anxiety, ADHD, other mental health
Mhm.
diagnoses in their generations. And then also, just as a consumer and as a transactor of business, they are high on valuing authenticity and transparency. So they like to find those in counterparties for what they do business with. But they're also a very cynical and non-trusting generation. These are all characteristics that they tend to define themselves as in a variety of studies that we'll talk about a little bit later on today. But generally speaking, those are just some high-level characteristics of the generation, specifically socially and financially.
Yeah, it's
And I'll
interesting.
Yeah,
When
I think
you
Harrison can touch on it too.
when you just overgeneralize, I think I hear from my cohort, peers, friends, etc. It seems like every generation, the prior generation, the younger generation, either one or two generations younger, there's always they're lazier, they've got
Mhm.
different goals and focuses, etc. It's obviously not true for everybody. Harrison is a great Gen Z. He obviously works hard. But Harrison, what's your more anecdotal experience of uh, Gen Z, just how they go about their lives, how they think about working with financial institutions or financial partners?
So yeah, I would say I think Alex really hit on the head. Like it's just much more skeptical of big institutions. We saw, my first introduction to the financial world when I was 12 years old was watching Lehman Brothers fall, watching Bear
Hmm.
Stearns fall, watching the housing market collapse from underneath. My family was very lucky. We remained relatively untouched, but there were a lot of kids on the block who had their parents had to sell their house. A lot of stuff just that seemed rock solid just
Hmm.
collapsed from underneath them. And I feel like that was a hallmark of a lot of kids in my generation. And to another point, I would say all on the flip side of that though, while my generation I do feel we are skeptical, I found an article about this I could show it to you later, but I did see that Gen Z is also much more loyal than previous generations, that we
Mhm.
want to stick with firms that show us respect, that show us love, like I am in right now.
Hmm.
But I did think that was very interesting. There's much more of the idea of like, what's my next job? What's my next thing going to
Hmm.
be? It's much more like, how am I going to set down roots here and really build something that I want to do?
Yeah, no, I've been at the same company for 16 plus years, and I think in all the people, all my friends and coworkers that I could think of, well, maybe not my coworkers, but my friends and clients, I could think of, on one hand, how many people have been working at the same company for that period of time. Almost everyone is moving jobs every 2 to 4 years, just kind of my generation. So it'll be interesting to see if the tides have turned there. They care more about work-life balance and loyalty to sticking in one place. So it's just kind of interesting from that perspective.
What what is an interesting facet to that too is um, in Gen Z they may or they may they there may exist a scenario where they tend to stay in jobs or professions longer, but it's also impacted by the fact that that one position career is not the only thing that's generating income
Hmm.
or fulfillment, right? This is a generation that is very entrepreneurial by spirit. So a fair amount of them, actually in that same E&Y study, we're looking at roughly 56% of Gen Z participants in the workforce are receiving income from some sort of freelance or side hustle work. Um,
56%. That's a
yeah,
number.
and 40% of them have both that and a day job.
Hmm.
So there is definitely a little bit of multiple factors going in here and generational differences, right? When you look at how different generations viewed the prospect of having a second job,
Hmm.
for Gen X, right? So the generation slightly above us, a second job was a source of shame. Like you needed to get a second job because the first one didn't pay enough to make ends
Hmm.
meet,
Hmm.
while millennials is the generation where you get the start of the gig economy. There are people who are now starting to do things on the side, the Uber, DoorDash,
Hmm.
Amazon, like that type of secondary freelance work. But Gen Z is very much pragmatic in approaching to different ways to diversify their income and support their lifestyle, and it's much more of a badge of honor than something would compare to a Gen X person who say, I needed to get a second job just to make the ends meet, right? Um, and
Do you have
to
any
to
statistics
that's
on what are those types of side jobs?
so a lot of them are geared towards starting or doing their own business. So 42% of them are very or extremely likely to start their own business. In
Love that.
specific lines of work, it could be a little tough to find the best specifics on that or statistics. Um, but the reality is that they are finding ways to make money in non-traditional ways, at least that are non-traditional in the current paradigm, right? We
Hmm.
may very
Hmm.
much in 20, 30 years see a shift even more into the Gen A or Generation Alpha set of participants in the workforce that also enforce that there are more than just one career path or one way to generate income than the 9 to 5. And we'll certainly see that grow from millennials, again, starting that gig economy, the Ubers of the world, into how Gen Z has fully embraced that. And it's also, this may also come as a result of kind of what are we handing off to Gen Z, right? Gen Z is likely to inherit roughly about $11 trillion from the boomer generation, right? The wealthiest generation. That's much less compared to what Gen X and the millennials will likely inherit. Gen X is probably going to inherit roughly $30 trillion, with millennials likely to inherit $27 million worth of inheritance. So this is a generation that's grown up and been impacted by significantly or had significant impacts from financial downturns at very key points of development, like the 2007 global recessions. A lot of them is probably when they were kids and they saw that in the home. And then the 2020 coronavirus shutdown the economy. That's probably right around the time that they were either graduating college or going into college. So this is a generation that is likely had much more to endure, psychologically speaking, seeing that outside existing structures don't always generate the needed support system or financial income that they need. They're going to find a way to overcome those barriers and necessarily just let the normal traditions satisfy what they need for income purposes. So they're a little bit, they're able to pivot better. They're more entrepreneurial, generally speaking. They are more pragmatic. All that speaks to that psychology.
I love that they're more entrepreneurial. I think that's awesome. I think we'll continue to find more and more small companies, whether contracting work or consulting or whatever you call it, especially as AI becomes more prevalent. It just becomes that much easier to build a company, either on your own or with a much smaller staff. It's also interesting that on the one hand, they're probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're probably doing things a little later. Like they're probably moving out of their parents' house a little later, getting married a little later, expect to inherit less or not do quite as well financially. And, maybe that changes as they get older. But on the other hand, they're also taking on more risk, as any entrepreneur would know. You start a business, that's it's not a sure thing.
Yeah. And the way that Gen Z sees risk, and this is where we can start to transition a little bit into how they directly interface with, the typical financial services that are offered out there in the marketplace, right? Gen Z is a generation that is, again, very critical and cynical of existing paradigms. So they are not the generation that is quickest in most situations to embrace something like the traditional stock market, right? They are when we look at the averages of when people start to save and invest and what percentage of that generation tend to save and invest, while they do start earlier than other generations, they do less as a percentage. So for instance, Gen Z on average starts to save into cash, generally speaking, at around age 18 and invest at age 19. While we look at millennials, Gen X, and boomers, millennials tend to save into cash starting in their mid-20s, investing in their mid-20s. Gen X even later, 31 and 32. But the percentage of those populations that do start to take financial action by saving and investing, Gen Z, only about 45% of Gen Z to take those action, while millennials do 54% and Gen X is about 58%. So there's a bit of a gap into embracing those traditional, hey, we should have a cash position, hey, we should grow our portfolio, hey, we should save into our 401ks, right? And from the surface, it's very obvious that they have tend to gravitated towards a different, embracing a different structure, something like Bitcoin or the available information to them on financial TikTok, for example. 79% of, this is a bit of a blended statistic, but 79% of millennials or Gen Z have gotten financial advice sourced from social media. They also have some preconceived notions about what it is to have a financial plan, should they have one, right? They're much more a la carte preference when it comes to their financial services. 43% of them don't believe that they have enough money to start a financial plan, and 25% of them say it's it seems too complicated to create a plan.
Hmm.
So they're in a situation where they pick and choose what's available to them from the input of, they're getting fed certain ideas and topics specifically through social media, and they're not naturally gravitating towards the existing structures that exist as frequently or as prevalently as millennials or Gen X before them. So it's a bit of an interesting behavioral thing to observe from Gen Z.
Yeah, anytime you're getting your advice from social media, if they are not licensed and then subject to compliance, be a little skeptical as what they are saying or not saying, because when people like advisors like us, obviously we're going to be maybe a little biased on this topic, but when we have to abide by strict compliance guidelines so that we are saying truthful statements, not misleading the public, the same is not true for people who are not licensed. They don't have that requirement. So, a lot of great resources out there, whether it's on podcasts or social media, and there's a lot of resources that you may want to think a little twice about. Maybe use it as an introductory to some topic you didn't further know about, and then dive in a little deeper on, does this make sense? Harrison, what about like Bitcoin and owning real estate? Or it doesn't have to be Bitcoin, but just cryptocurrency in general. Does everyone own crypto? Does everyone want to own real estate eventually? Like what's the thought process there?
I would say among my cohort, if people do not own crypto, they are at the very least what I would refer to as crypto curious. They
Hmm.
know about it. They've been hearing it for years. I think I've told everyone this story is a guy came to me in high school when I was, probably 16 years old, was telling me about this blockchain and
Hmm.
it's money on the internet. And I looked at him and said, like, no, that's insane. Go away. And he was telling me about Bitcoin when it was $90, and
Hmm.
I didn't listen to him.
Hmm. A lot of
Um,
people have that
and a
story.
lot of people, but we have seen it all. It pushed through all the naysayers. Even our initial thing was like, it's not real money, to become a real financial asset that we're seeing big institutions recognize, like JP Morgan, I think, just put together their own ETF
Hmm.
of Bitcoin. And in terms of real estate, look, I would say that a lot of my cohort is also very real estate curious as well, but it's much less about, I would say, wanting to buy a home. It's much more they want to look at it as a source of income. I hear a lot from my friends about, like, I want to start buying properties, create passive income like that. And I'm just like, yeah, that's great. That's a legitimate way of building up income. But I would say the other thing they really don't think about is, like, you do have to be a landlord. Like, that is a
Hmm.
job in and of itself. It's not exactly passive income in the way that I think maybe you're hearing about on social media.
Hmm.
Yep.
But then to another point, like, I had a very interesting conversation with a few of my friends. One guy in particular, I went to high school with, was a smart, nice guy in high school. Never had a problem with him. He's married now. He's got two kids, and has a real job. Very respectable dude. And I was having this conversation with him. It's like, yeah, I don't ever want to buy property. That just seems like a boomer scam. And I'm just like, what? I didn't want to argue with him on the point, but
Hmm.
it was very interesting to hear a guy who I do think is pretty smart. Just look at property as something that's not viable whatsoever. And then on the other hand, I have friends who just want to do nothing but buy multifamilies.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a sense amongst that generation, and it's also prevalent in millennials, that the relative difficulty of buying a home for either an individual or family is objectively harder now than it was for older generations like Boomer and Gen X. Um, the income piece from the anecdotal evidence you're providing is prevalent amongst the research of and segmenting of Generation Z as a whole. If buying and owning and operating a rental property is a possibility for them financially, that's another way of diversifying their income stream. That's another way
Hmm.
that they have to have less reliance on just their 9 to 5 income. They will do it, right? This is I think it speaks to the way that Gen Z interestingly views risk. That is a way for them to diversify, right? It's not diversifying their equity portfolio. It's certainly not diversifying their crypto portfolio, but it is a way for them to have and introduce some, not necessarily stability, although it could lead to that, but some ability that to not have to rely on something that might be more variable. Again, they're cynical, right? They've seen entire Fortune 500 companies, hedge funds, investment banks just go belly up, entire households impacted by that. Because it's, what can they control about what their employers do, right? There's only so much, and I'm not saying generally, but layoffs do happen as a reality of being in a working age and in a workforce. This is a way for them to be able to take a hit like that and be less impacted. That is a way for them to diversify out of risk. Interestingly enough, from some anecdotal experience, and I'll actually provide some stats around this too, they can't seem to hold that perspective outside of or to apply that same perspective to something like, hey, this is what I have on paper. Am I concentrated or am I diversified? Am I actually aggressive in my risk appetite or am I conservative? I worked with a group of interns over the summer for this consulting firm, and their idea, that their project was to build essentially a financial literacy 101 application that they can push out to their Gen Z, like their cohort, right? So recently graduated, actually tipping to the very start of Gen A. And I had asked them personally just to get a feel for the group, what is your current familiarity with the existing structures that are out there? Like, do you guys have investments, cash savings, so to speak? Very few of them had, a fair amount of them had cash savings, so they understood the concept of cash flow and budgeting. Very few of them had direct exposure into, like, I take money and I invest it into a low-cost mutual fund, or I have, I talk to an advisor, right? Granted, some of that is because of where they are in their career, but a fair amount of they didn't have exposure to what it's like to own or manage a portfolio, even through indirect exposure through their parents either. But they all either expressed a desire or had an existing crypto position and had very much been in a social scenario where the people around them were constantly talking about it. I don't want to say hyping it up, but it was a strong topic of conversation to the point where it had become so standard in the conversation that they didn't find that that had the same level of risk because they knew about it more and talked about it more than a stock portfolio. If you were to ask me, what's the difference in volatility between tracking the S&P 500 and having a index or a generalized diversified holding of cryptocurrency, those are generally going to be two very different experiences. And we've seen it, very recently in the last couple of weeks, both up and down today. So it's interesting that their views of risk are not necessarily uniform or they don't scale, but they are working in ways to be conservative just like everyone else, whether it's not to rely on just an income stream from 9 to 5, whether it's to not rely on, again, equity structures that have not worked out for them in personal anecdotal experience in the past. But they don't keep it consistent across other decisions like choosing to get involved in crypto, choosing to jump on a meme stock that might come up. There's a lot of FOMO-driven investment decisions, the fear of missing out. It's very prevalent in Gen Z. So it's an interesting kind of characteristic that they have.
And just to be clear, we're not recommending anyone own or purchase Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. Speak to your advisor if you have one. If you don't, go find one. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to us that the volatility of any investment is what defines risk. When you see more volatility, that's typically means more risk, and more often than not, more risk means in the long run you should expect a higher return, but that's not always the case. And so it's interesting that Gen Z is prioritizing crypto before other maybe more traditional things, although it sounds like everyone's still putting their money in 401ks for the most part. So I think it probably just comes down to some of it is age related. They're at the start of their careers, and so as they move on, as they start to earn more money, get married and have kids, maybe they're making different decisions. But it sounds like because they're so skeptical, they're probably doing more of it on their own with various financial institutions as opposed to finding, one or two professionals or institutions that are going to give them guidance. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I'd say that sounds pretty accurate because again, the way that they're getting served these different strategies or even the different products that one might use in the hopes of rounding out your financial picture, it's basically what's next on their timeline or on their feed through whatever social media app they're getting generated, right? Maybe
Hmm.
some of them venture out and read and kind of educate themselves about what there is out there, but when the content is served to you, if you have a natural interest to it, you're getting served these products and then you can either choose to look into it more or not. There is very little binding throughout the different products themselves to round out a picture, right? There's not a holistic perspective to it,
Hmm.
or at least it would be tough for me to find one there.
Hmm.
And frankly, it is something that, especially us kind of as a firm, we see that there's a ton of value that in the different facets of what we do, investment planning, protection planning, each one of those dominoes very much relies on the others
Yeah.
because you can't operate in a vacuum for each one of those pieces. They are one piece that actually flow into each other. So,
Yeah.
and again, they have a tendency to not embrace what is a holistic or rounded out financial plan. They don't believe that they have that it's only an asset based metric to be able to say, hey, a financial plan is worth it for me right now because I
Hmm.
have the money saved up. It's not their natural inclination to say, I'm getting this started. I should start building a plan now and then grow into it. We don't see that happen.
Yeah, I always say any decision that you make in one area of your finances will impact every other area. And so don't think of your finances in silos of 401k, investments, auto insurance, renter's insurance, crypto, but look at it from the bigger picture perspective. If you're trying to balance risk, what are the different risk profiles of investments that you have? If you're trying to balance liquidity, what are the different liquidity profiles? Meaning, 401k is virtually no liquidity, cash 100% liquidity. So, maybe find some things in between along the way. Guys, as we're wrapping up, are there any things you want to make sure we touch on as it relates to Gen Z, how they move in the world, how they think about financial planning or financial institutions that you want to make sure the audience is aware of?
Harrison, I'm going to give you the floor here because nothing better than direct from the source.
No, I would say what really stuck out to me is Alex, you used the word a lot of decision making is based around FOMO. I really couldn't agree with that more. I feel a lot of people in my generation, and maybe even goes back to why they're averse to financial planning. It's because I think a lot of them feel as though the good times are over, as if what worked for their parents, what worked for their grandparents, is not going to work for them in that time when they're age. Um, and I think it just goes back to the cynicism, I believe that's the word, towards just the powers that be, the systems in place. And I think one of the big things I've had to kind of talk with my friends about, a lot of people in my cohort, is just, no, listen, things are changing, but it's not, you're getting very Tony Soprano about it. Like, you don't have to, no, it's like at the beginning, he says, I came at the end, the good times are over. It's like the good times are not over. They're just changing. And
Mhm.
you have to make a plan to be able to deal with that change. And that's something that I believe that, you know, as I've been talking with them, I've helped some people realize that, like, oh, yeah, this things are going to look different. They might not be as cool as in certain respects as when my grandparents were coming up, my parents were coming up, but there's opportunity there that can be capitalized on to make it so that you could probably do better than they did just because to be frank, it was a little bit easier to do well back in the day.
Hmm.
Does that
Yeah, I
make
think
sense?
anytime you can just as early as possible, just surround yourself with trustworthy, knowledgeable professionals, you're going to serve yourself well.
Yeah.
And so the sooner the better, start to build your quote unquote team of who's going to give you financial advice, who's going to give you investment advice, who's going to give you tax advice. And maybe those professionals change and evolve as you change and evolve. But the sooner you can start to learn from actual professionals, not just, TikTok professionals, but actual financial professionals, I think you'll serve yourself well. Alex, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that nails it right on the head.
Love it. Well, it's good to have you guys on the pod. To the listening audience, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. We'll certainly be coming back for more, but hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please like, subscribe, do all the things that we appreciate. We read all the reviews and appreciate them. So have a good one, and until next time.